listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. Almost 2.5 million people are growing old alone, living in a house they own, but with no spouse, partner or children to live with them. Since 1990, that number has grown by half as much again. The Mental Health Foundation says loneliness is often overlooked and often carries a stigma. This comes as the Office for National Statistics say marriages in the UK are at their lowest ever rate. Joining me to discuss what it's like to be lonely and why weddings are becoming out of fashion is Joanne Edwards, a partner, lawyer and mediator from law firm Manches. Simon Lawton-Smith, Head of Policy at the Mental Health Foundation. Christina Victor, a Professor of Gerontology and Public Health at Brunel University. And American culture historian and blogger Tim Stanley. What's the current picture in the UK with loneliness and what's happening with the number of people who aren't living with anyone?
Well, we need to make the distinction between sort of loneliness and solitude, I think, just at the very start, because they're not the same thing. Loneliness is a problem when it becomes chronic and people are not only sort of feeling isolated emotionally, they might live in the middle of a big city, but they feel lonely because they have an emotional isolation. But there's also social isolation, people who perhaps live on the top floor of a high-rise block, they have a disability, they can't get out, they never see anybody from one day or another. So I think we need to be remembering that being alone isn't necessarily the same as being lonely. Having said that, we did some survey work about 2 years ago which suggested that at least half of the population believe that as a society we are getting more lonely. There are more people in society who are lonely. And the problem for us at the Mental Health Foundation is that we know chronic loneliness leads not only to mental health problems but to physical health problems as well. Christina
Victor, now you're from Brunel University and you say there's necessarily not any evidence to say that actually loneliness is a bigger problem than it was?
That's correct. My particular interest is in looking at ageing and later life. And if we look at older people, so that's people aged 65 and over, levels of loneliness in Britain for that age group are no different now, so the 2000s, than they were when the initial surveys were conducted in the 1950s. So it's, I think, a common stereotype that people are more lonely or there's a higher prevalence of loneliness that isn't borne out by the empirical data. What is true is that there are certainly more people who live alone, and as the previous speaker was saying, it's very easy to conflate living alone with being lonely, where in fact they're two very distinct and different concepts. And one has shown a massive change, so we have many more people living alone across the age groups, and I think the empirical evidence is that one hasn't particularly changed, i.e. levels of loneliness are pretty stable over the last 6 decades.
So there's no evidence for the fact that if you live alone, you're definitely going to be lonely, and therefore...
No. I mean, it's certainly true that the groups who are most vulnerable to loneliness are the bereaved and those who live alone. But if we say in the general population of older people, roughly 10% of people have what we might call chronic or enduring loneliness. And then if we look at particular groups within that, the groups who have the highest levels of loneliness would be those living alone, where it's probably about 20%, as opposed to those who are married, when it's 2%. So although it's higher in people who live alone, it isn't universal by any manner of means.
But we're looking here to see if there's a sort of correlation between the decline in marriage and the increase of divorce and people living alone, and whether this is a real shift in society now, even though I know that obviously you and Simon are coming from very tangible solutions to dealing with a sort of a psychology of loneliness as opposed to the physical implications of being lonely. But this does bring us on to the role of marriage within a society. And I've got with me here in the studio Jo Edwards, a partner and lawyer from the firm Manches, who has given speeches on why marriage isn't worth it anymore.
Yes, I mean, certainly I've spoken at both the Oxford and Durham unions in the past couple of years about the decline of marriage and the fact that really it's not in vogue anymore. Now, I have to say on both occasions I was defeated quite heavily, and those actually in the unions at each of those universities were very much pro-marriage. But I think one can't get round the fact that clearly marriage rates are in free fall and have been for some considerable time. So there's been a decline of about 83% over a 25-year period. And certainly as a family lawyer, that's what I'm witnessing, that the divorce rate is, although it's steady, it's declining simply because the marriage rate is declining as well.
And Tim Stanley, you've done a lot of research into the American culture of marriage and divorce. What would you say? Is Britain following a pattern here like it has in America?
Yeah, I think the two are fairly similar. British rates of marriage are at their lowest since records began. And if you go to America in 1972, in 1960, roughly 72% of American adults were married. Today, it's roughly half, so the numbers have fallen. There are three simple reasons for that. First of all, changing patterns of sexual practice. So since the greater availability of contraception, there's less risk of pregnancy, so people don't feel compelled to get married. Secondly, women have much greater financial support outside marriage, either through the state giving them assistance with child rearing or because they're working. So they just don't need a man anymore. And thirdly, secularization, the decline of a religious impulse to get married. Having said all of that, though, I disagree that culturally marriage is out of vogue. If you consider that on election night, on Tuesday, 2 states voted to legalize gay marriage, that's an example of a minority actually fighting for the right to marry. Marriage matters enough to gay and lesbian people that they would campaign to be allowed to do it by law. So I think that it still retains a great deal of cultural power. It's just that people have more freedom than they used to have to either choose to do it or choose not to do it. I just think that the structure of marriage as one man, one woman married in a church, that's changed. But in terms of partnerships and people forming new kinds of relationships, that hasn't necessarily changed. And those people could effectively be common law married without necessarily going through the usual Christian or Jewish or whatever service. So I just feel from a general standing above it and looking over the whole of American culture, I still see marriage as having a great deal of significance to people's lives and how they define themselves as individuals, just not in the way that it used to. I think it's an integral part of human nature, actually. The desire, partly it's a product of love, the desire to say to someone, I love you, and to declare that publicly. Partly because it brings a degree of stability, which again, because of changes in the law, doesn't have to come anymore through an actual marriage. If we go back to gays and lesbians, those people in most states in America can get a civil union, so they can make some other kind of legal declaration of their relationship. But certainly the need for stability, the need for company, and I was very interested to discover, as I just heard on your show, that levels of loneliness have not greatly fluctuated in the last 6 decades. That suggests to me that relationships, formal relationships, are still important to people.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. Joining me to discuss what it's like to be lonely and why weddings are becoming unpopular is Joanne Edwards from law firm Manches, Simon Lawton-Smith, Head of Policy at the Mental Health Foundation, Christina Victor, a Professor of Gerontology, and American cultural historian and blogger Tim Stanley.
I mean, I think, first of all, I do think it's right that marriage isn't in vogue. It is very clear. I'm talking about being in vogue purely from a statistical perspective. And if one crunches the numbers, it's absolutely clear that marriage rates have declined very significantly over the past 25 years. I completely agree with the point, however, that, of course, there are other types of relationship. And I'm bound to say I was quite surprised by some of the statistics in the ONS report about the numbers of people living alone, because as family practitioners, what we're really seeing is that marriage isn't being replaced by lots of people living alone. I guess you'd say in response to that, well, family lawyers don't see the people living on their own. You're only going to see couples. But what we are seeing is a huge surge in the number of people cohabiting without getting married, and very often actively choosing not to get married and choosing that in its stead. So I do remain of the view that marriage really it isn't in vogue in this country.
With the decline in marriage, or with the decline in the very nature of people wanting to stay together. Will this have any effect on the mental health of those people living alone in the future? What sort of society change will we see?
I think there is a really interesting point that we have to bear in mind, that it's very interesting that, if you like, prevalence rates of loneliness do not seem to be increasing. But the fact is we have larger populations in this country, in the UK at the moment, and the population rate is still going up. We have more older people, an ageing population, who are people who will eventually find themselves in their 80s, in their 90s, maybe even in their hundreds in 20 or 30 years' time, who do not have a partner, who may have had a life partner, but they'll have passed away. And I think we need to keep a very close eye on levels of loneliness. Of course, it's quite hard to measure loneliness, so it's difficult to know when a person could be described as experiencing chronic loneliness. What we do know is that chronic loneliness causes not only mental health problems in terms of increasing levels of stress and depression and anxiety, but actually it causes physiological changes to your body, which means it can, for example, adversely impact on your immune function or your cardiovascular function. So actually our main concern is to, first of all, raise awareness that loneliness is perhaps more common out there than we like to think. There's a certain stigma attached to being lonely. People don't like to admit they're lonely. But to recognise that in our community, in society out there, there are huge numbers of people who live very lonely lives, and this is a problem for them. It's not a sort of nice solitude where you sit reading a book and you're enjoying your evenings. It's a loneliness where you crave company and you feel very unsatisfied emotionally. And that will lead to increased rates of depression, anxiety, problems with heart disease in the future. And we just think we need to keep a very close eye on this and raise awareness of loneliness as a public health issue, if you like, when previously it hasn't been thought of as such. I know we're talking particularly about older people here, but we need to bear in mind that some lonely people with chronic loneliness may be from younger groups of people, like the unemployed or lone parents. We have many more lone parents than we used to have. People with long-term disabilities as well, maybe younger and experiencing loneliness. But if you just take the older population, we know that in the future we have a real problem paying for the care of elderly people, and particularly people who will experience dementia. We know about 1 in 3 older people will eventually experience dementia, a very debilitating disease, very distressing for people. These are people who will often be living by themselves. They will need a lot of social care, a lot of health care. How are we actually going to afford that in the future? And we haven't so far talked about the money side of it, but I think we need to bear in mind that we need to think how society can afford to provide good care and support for people in the future who are living by themselves, are lonely, but may be experiencing significant levels of both physical and mental health problems.
Christine, I'd like to bring you into the discussion again. Are we facing a public health problem with this matter of loneliness in society if the marriage rates continue to fall? It paints quite a dreary picture, doesn't it?
Well, I'm not sure that it's dreary, but I mean, it's certainly true that loneliness can be certainly constructed as a public health issue, because there is some very interesting American work which suggests that actually smoking, loneliness has worse health outcomes than people who smoke. So it's a significant health issue in terms of reducing people's life expectancy and compromising quality of life. So it's not an insignificant problem. And although the percentage of people experiencing loneliness hasn't gone up, there are obviously more people who are at risk. So in absolute terms, we probably have more lonely people than we used to do. But what we do about it, I think, is really challenging, because loneliness is the deficit or the lack of either the quantity or the quality of social relationships that you want. So it's about, you can have it, that could be with one person or it could be with 20 people. And so how, as service providers, we replace that, I think, is really challenging. All too often when people are caring, particularly for older people, and this is not a negative comment about district nurses or other healthcare professionals, they may go into a frail older person and dress their leg ulcer and do that technically extremely well, but they don't have time to establish a relationship with that person. And I think that's the challenge of thinking about how we can deliver services that are not only technically good, but where people have the time to spend with their clients and care recipients to actually provide meaningful social contact as well. So, I guess the state is not going to pay for this in the future, and we need to think of other ways of developing social networks for people.
Tim Stanley, then, just to bring you back into the discussion, Christine mentioned the American study that loneliness is more dangerous for your health than, say, smoking. And you're coming from an American perspective in terms of marriage rates and divorce rates. What do you see as a shift in society that's taking place in the US?
Well, I think there are things which are also happening in the UK, like movement of labour. So when people move around a lot, it's difficult to form relationships. Urbanisation. You can live in a city surrounded by loads of people, but not really get to know them because it's not quite the same as living in the place where you grew up, a small community where everyone talks to each other. I think there's also a general trend, which, I'm throwing out stuff here for which I have no statistical data. This is just things I have noticed about the culture. There's also a trend among young people to say, I don't need to get married yet, or I don't need to commit to a full-time relationship yet, because there are such pressures upon achieving things in your career throughout your 20s and 30s that you delay and delay and delay doing those sorts of things. So I think there's a sense that the economy itself is actually prejudiced against the forming of relationships. Then again, I'm always a little resistant about government solutions to these sorts of things because if nothing else, I think we find ourselves in a strange situation where the state provides company for people.
Yeah.
I would see these things as challenges to us as individuals and as communities, that if there's someone lonely next door, you should speak to them. And if you are lonely yourself, then that is something, if you're physically and mentally able to, that is something you ought to address. I'd always be a little bit resistant about the idea of government becoming your bigger brother.
Jo Edwards, though, you said that, politicians are starting to acknowledge that marriage isn't the be-all and end-all. What would your response be to Tim?
I mean, in terms of what Tim has said, I completely agree. I want to pick up on a particular point. He mentioned the fact that people are saying increasingly, well, we don't need to get married yet. We want to live our lives first. We want to establish our careers. We want to buy our properties. We want to buy our first car, etc., etc. And that very much is the trend. And in fact, last year, for the first time in this country, the average age for a woman marrying for the first time hit 30. And for men, the average age is about 32, 33. And because I know from my practice that the average length of a marriage is around 11 or 12 years, that then feeds into, I think, these statistics about the 45 to 64-year-old age group and the fact that they are living on their own. So I think people are, on average, marrying at about 32, 33. On average, they're married for about 11 years. And then they're hitting this period where they are perhaps living on their own thereafter. And I think another trend that we've seen as lawyers is also that once people have been married and if they are going through a divorce, and of course that can be very painful, as we know, both in terms of the emotions involved, but the financial outcome for them. Very often the clients I see say to me, never again. I never want to marry ever again. Now I've been through that process once, that's it. I will always remain on my own. And much as the romantic in me will always try to persuade them otherwise, and the lawyer in me will say, well, have a prenup. If you're going to have a second marriage, and particularly if you've got children from a first marriage and an established asset base which you want to protect, do have a prenup.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare, and we're talking about what it's like to be lonely and why weddings are becoming more unpopular. I'm joined by partner, lawyer and mediator Joanne Edwards, Simon Lawton-Smith, who's head of policy at the Mental Health Foundation, Christina Victor, who's a professor of gerontology, and American culture historian and blogger Tim Stanley. Tim, is this a trend that you've seen in America?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think an important addition to that, by the way, none of this detracts from my general feeling that relationships are still important to people and they can define them as marriage. But another important aspect of that is changing cultural attitudes about sexual monogamy. If you go back into the 1950s and 60s, actually surprising numbers of people, and in this instance I'm talking about UK statistics, surprising numbers of people did have sex before marriage. But in the vast, vast majority of cases, they married the person they had sex with. So it's not that we were all a nation of virgins. It's just that we were very selective about the people we would sleep with and then the relationships we would form with them. Today, that's completely gone. That's totally changed. Most people have a sexual relationship with someone other than their life partner or wife or husband before they marry them. And that's also obviously measured in changing patterns of birth outside of wedlock, etc., etc. And I think a lot of that's reflected in the culture. We have a culture which encourages the idea, and it kind of, self-fulfilling, that sex outside marriage is normal and is something very different from marriage. That's an important change. So people want to be freer, and they want to have a greater range of options than simply the idea that you sleep with the person you marry and you produce children. That's dramatically changed.
So you're bringing this sort of sexual dimension into the argument as to why maybe people don't view marriage like they used to.
I am, and I've got no proof of this, and this is purely speculation, but I would imagine there would be some link between that and loneliness. Because when you have a sexual culture which isn't necessarily about relationships, but it's more about personal fulfillment and satisfaction, whilst that's very liberating, it somewhat divorces sex and patterns of sexual behavior from building relationships with people and getting to know people. And I would imagine that would contribute to a sense of isolation within society, that even though you're sleeping with a lot of people, you're not necessarily connecting with them.
Simon, you seem to be nodding in an agreement there.
I think there's something very interesting about the emotional connection that Tim's just pointed out, which is absolutely right. And this is the question of the relationship you have with people needs to be of value to you. It needs to be a quality relationship to avoid any risk of loneliness within a relationship. I think we also need to bear in mind that we've been talking about, we're sort of making assumptions in a way, perhaps, that marriage is good and divorce is bad. I think we need to bear in mind that there are good and bad marriages. Yeah. And arguably people's mental health is improved by getting out of a very destructive relationship, married or not, and living by yourself, rather than made worse. So I think we need to bear in mind that it's quite difficult to discuss this in general terms about the whole population. And the other thing I thought might be interesting to bring is the question of cultural differences in how different minority ethnic groups, for example, in the UK, will view marriage. We talked previously about premarital sex is now pretty much, on the cards for everybody. It's how society works. Well, it is perhaps for white British society. It won't be perhaps for people from Southeast Asian backgrounds or West African backgrounds. There are just different communities in the UK, which is a very diverse community here, particularly in London, where we're speaking from. And I think that just needs to be brought into the argument.
You can be in a marriage and be lonely. And of course, in previous decades, in the 50s and 60s, in which the norm was marriage and the norm was childbirth, that did not mean that people were any happier. And you look at some of the American sociological studies like Betty Friedan that come out from that period, and the conclusion she reaches is that a large number of women self-medicated with alcohol, who are within marriages, who are living, by many governmental standards, a very happy, fulfilled, and materially successful life, were actually chronically lonely. And it is a mistake to purely measure the social health of a society by rates of marriage and rates of divorce. I think that isn't a fair measure of the quality of individuals' lives.
Christine, then, without then measuring society on divorce rates or marriage rates, is the liberation of sex, women's equal opportunities, has that become harmful to society in a way that will leave society a lonelier place?
I think I echo some of my colleagues' comments. It's very difficult to generalise about these big social trends. For many women, the ability to join the labour market, to actually, with equal opportunities and equal pay legislation, to actually be paid a fair remuneration for the work they do, has been extremely liberating, because they can establish their own households and live independently if they want, and perhaps within a marriage have a more equal relationship. One of the things I would like to pick up was one of the speakers mentioned about minority groups. And if we're talking generally about people who are vulnerable to loneliness, then certainly people, and particularly women from Pakistani and Bangladeshi populations in Britain, have extremely high rates of loneliness, and yet most of those are married.
Simon, and as we're drawing to a close, what would your sort of final words be?
Well, I think, first of all, it's to say how welcome this debate is, because one of the messages from the work we've done at the Mental Health Foundation is to try simply to get people to be more aware that there are huge numbers of people out there who are lonely. And that's lonely not just because they're not going out with their friends at night, but it's lonely in a chronic way, that day in, day out, they're not seeing enough people, they're not engaging in a quality way and having relationships. So there is certainly that. I think what I'd also like to say is that we shouldn't despair about this, but once we've recognised the problem, we need to think about how we can create environments that encourage good relationships in local communities, good relationships individually and personally between people. It might be, for example, lowering crime levels in an inner city area so that people feel, perhaps older people in particular, feel it's safe to go out of their front door in the evening, down to the pub to have a drink with some friends. So there are plenty of things we can do in terms of trying to create an environment in our communities and in society which helps to stop people becoming lonely in the first place.
Jo, would you be more aware now of the legacy of loneliness, or what could happen to them, and would it influence your thoughts or advice in any way?
I think certainly more aware, and it certainly would influence my advice. I mean, I really, just to pick up on a point which has been a thread of the discussions we've had today, there seems to be an assumption that loneliness should be and is equated with people living on their own. And that's certainly not the case. When I first see a client who is contemplating going through a divorce, I would always send them off for counselling and try to have them work that through. But if that doesn't succeed, I then have to talk through them the detail of why it is they are thinking of getting divorced, what are the reasons we're going to put to the court. And what I find is some very lonely people trapped within marriages who are very keen to get out and actually may well be better outside of the marriage. So I think that thought mustn't be lost, and it is a really important point.
Tim, I'd like a final word from you.
One thing I would pick up on is, I come from quite a conservative perspective, I won't deny that. And I tend to be rather critical of the cultural revolutions of the 60s and 70s. But one good thing about them, among many, but one particularly good thing, is the fact that people feel more free and have greater channels for expressing themselves than they did 40 or 50 years ago. And the very fact that people feel able to admit to loneliness and that there is someone they can talk to about it is a phenomenal and wonderful change in our society.
Christina Victor, an academic's perspective on all of this.
We've got a lot of research about loneliness. It's important to put the problem into context, so it isn't a universal experience. And we also have evidence that people can recover from loneliness. So I think perhaps the interesting research question to ask is not why people are lonely, but what is it that stops the majority of us, from experiencing loneliness, to tease that out and then try and nurture and strengthen that within society for people who are married, live alone, of whatever age they may be.
I'd really like to thank all my guests: Simon Lawton-Smith, Head of Policy at the Mental Health Foundation; Joanna Edwards, who's a partner and lawyer from the firm Manchers; Tim Stanley, blogger for the Daily Telegraph; and Christine Victor, Professor of Gerontology and Public Health at Brunel University.